Thank you all for coming out. We are the second one of the series, and we're still in person at Pale Fire. And I think that's worth a round right there. I'm excited for our guest author. We tried to get her here last year, but her schedule was very, very tight. And so I will introduce Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. She's the author of My Monticello, which you see up here. It's a fiction debut that was called a masterly feat by the New York Times. And it won quite a few prizes. I'm going to list a few here. The Balcones Fiction Prize, Lillian Smith Book Award, the Weatherford Award. Also was a finalist for the Kirkus Fiction Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Leonard Award, the LA Times debut Siedenbaum Prize, as well as long listed for a Penn Faulkner Fiction Award and the Story Prize. That, you'll see, I will show you soon, it's just a sample. Jocelyn has been a fellow at Tin House, Hedgebrook, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. Her writing has appeared in many spaces, including Guernica, The Guardian, and the Quelly Journal. Her short story, Control Negro, which is in My Monticello, was anthologized in the Best American Short Stories, guest edited by Roxane Gay, and read live by LeVar Burton. Yeah, I mean, these are some big things. She's a veteran public school art teacher, which I think deserves a round, and lives and writes just over the mountain in Charlottesville. So let's give her a warm welcome. What do you think about that crowd welcome?
So you all are, can you all hear me? You're the only ones except for the public librarian, the librarians yesterday cheered through the speech. You're the only other ones who've ever cheered during it. I love it.
Yay!
Breweries and librarians, that's it, from here on out.
Well, and I just want to say, I mentioned about the awards, but the paperback, this is her debut for the paperback of My Monticello. Tonight it's released at Books and Brews. Yeah. On the front cover, I opened this up early for another customer, and you can see the listing of awards. Those are all the awards that she's won on top of what I read, plus all of the lists that have said Best Books of 2021, runs from Kirkus to Maureen Corrigan. So phenomenal achievement. Yeah.
My parents are so proud. My parents are really proud. It's awesome. I'll just say, too, that it's so interesting to be introduced and to hear all those things. It feels like someone's talking about someone else. But I wrote for so long before I got something published. I was writing for many, many years. Seriously, I had an agent. I had another agent. I sent things out. And then this is my debut at 50 years old. So I'm excited about it. It's awesome. And it's how it was meant to be. But that's how it happened.
And so those are some of the kind of questions you can ask Jocelyn tonight. This is Q&A. I will be opening it up and talking with her, and then we'll open up to questions from you all. So that right there, just opening the door to how do you get there? How do you keep trying and trying to get there? And did you expect this kind of response when you put this book out?
I honestly didn't know what would happen. I had the feeling that the book spoke to the moment that we were in. And it did, but I didn't know how it would be received, and it's always an adventure. It's always interesting to see what happens.
Let's talk about the layout of the book. Some of those short stories were published earlier, and just sort of how did those short stories come together to become this book?
Yeah, so I was just writing short stories. I was teaching full-time as a public school art teacher in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was writing these stories, and I didn't think I was writing a collection. And then it occurred to me after I published Control Negro, that first story that was anthologized in Best American Short Stories and got some traction, I thought, there's some relationship between these stories. And so I said, maybe I'm making stories that are like, I say like pins in the map of Virginia, of places I've lived, kind of set in Alexandria, set in and around this area, set a lot in Charlottesville, because that's where I've lived for the last 20 years. And then I started writing forward from there, and I thought, okay, this is, and then I wrote the novella last. If anyone's read it, that was the last piece So yeah, that's how I kind of came to that. And the idea that connects the stories is this idea of home and belonging. Who gets to call a place home? Where does someone belong? What does Virginia mean?
And short stories, that's a popular genre, isn't it?
I would say short story, and I would say no. So at one point, when I started to write these stories, I had an agent, and she was like, I'm not a short story person. We had written a YA thing together, a YA coming of age book, and she said, I'll send it to a colleague. And this person said to me, I really like your stories. They're pretty good. You should write 2 novels first. Not 1, but 2. And then we'll bring this one out next. And I thought, you're not the person that is going to be excited about this project. I don't think this is going to work for me. The thing is, I was teaching public school full time. I was someone who really liked short stories and read short story collections. And I thought, this is what I want to make. And if I self-publish it, if it's an indie press, if my writer group reads it, this suits me and what I'm trying to do right now. And luckily, the world kind of accommodated it. Some of that is luck, some of it's the stories and what was happening in the world when this was coming out. And I think short stories are a little bit more in the zeitgeist now. I feel like they're out. I've seen collections out there, a little bit more prominently than they had been.
Yeah, I'm sort of a War and Peace person, the long story, but I can say these short stories, they fill you. I mean, they're short, which I think fits our mode of operation today. And then they leave you with something that's filled and to chew on. So I think I highly recommend being a not short story person.
Can I say one more thing about short stories? One thing I like well, first of all, I think I'm really distracted in general in life right now, with my phone and with all the things. And so it was easier for me to write, especially being a mom and teaching, to write a shorter piece and to just hold it in my mind while I was working on it. And I think it can be easier sometimes for readers to do that as well. And I think what I love about short story collections is they resist the idea of a single story. So I'm writing about mostly Black people, men and women who live in Virginia, but you can't say there's one perspective of that, even within this collection, because it's a world with very different characters, different ages, different voices, different ways of being. And so I kind of like that about it, right? So it just, within itself, it already tells you that this isn't, a manifesto of this is how a Black person feels here, right? Or a woman feels about this, or a young person feels about this. It's this collective.
Or an immigrant, or a child. Which, speaking of, was there a favorite? We'll get to My Monticello, since that's the novella that is named for the book. But was there a favorite of the short stories that you feel maybe hasn't had enough highlight to it? You want to give us a little?
Yeah, I don't have a favorite. It just depends. But I'll read just a tiny bit from the story that. The whole collection used to be called Virginia Is Not Your Home. That was kind of my working title, and that was the title of one of the stories. And I'm just going to read a little from the beginning. I might skip ahead a tiny bit. I'm just going to read like 2 or 3 minutes from it, and because it has a tiny bit of when I lived here in this area in it. So I thought, why not read it here?
So do you want to do that now?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. And did you all hear the title of that?
Virginia Is Not Your Home. They hung that name on you at birth, but Virginia was never your home. Read Nausea by Sartre and give yourself a new one. Trumpet your new name to the liver-spotted washroom mirror like a coronation. Gape your mouth and angle your tongue behind your teeth. While you're at it, work to remedy those other afflictions, that fetid high hill R that has planted itself in the middle of words like wash. Scrub the stink of manure from your clothing, and while your young body churns over the basin, keep whispering your new, still secret name. Believe that if you can just change this, you can change everything. When your furtive girl body begins to unfold, pull your hair back so severely that the boys don't tug you down beneath the bleachers. Take to wearing father's faded, stable flannels to ward off solicitations to their string of tissue paper dances. Don't accept it when they ask, "Who do you think you are?" Whenever you test some sweet, protracted word on your tongue. Don't accept the moldy hymnals, the marquee salvations, the wayward way that mama courts heaven like a scornful lover. Don't ache too badly for the milk cows in the pastures, their slick, contoured ribs pressing through. Take French, lock your doors, and trust in your 16-year-old self. Fill out an array of applications, but don't tell mama when you win a scholarship to an all-girls college toward the center of the state. Instead, let the screen door clap closed behind you. Feel the brisk air rush by as you sprint barefoot through her hand-me-down fields. Run past the paddock where your father attends to their cruelest horses, all the way to the muddy creek banks. As breath stings your lungs and a stitch crawls up your rib cage, howl victorious into the night sky. Work harder still, and as soon as you are able, transfer to a bigger school, one with a better language department. Don't fret that it still sits in your namesake state, Virginia or Jenny, like that one sweet-faced grade school friend used to call you, those girls you grew up with who preened in pickup headlights, who got themselves knocked up and abandoned before they reached legal drinking age. Work double shifts at the rural country club at the outskirts of your Blue Ridge college town. The steep, winding bike rides make you feel like you've hardly left the place that reared you. Shuttle trays to large round tables, gin and tonics, jumbo shrimp cocktails, chicken cordon bleus. Ancient couples shift in three-piece suits and gowns glinting with costume jewelry. All that pomp against your black V-neck sweater and second skin leggings, your hair always coming undone around your face. The men ogle your cleavage, a few pinch your bottom, saying, "Smile, why don't you?" Watch how as soon as their wives turn away, they circle back and lay more money on your table, save every damn penny, and buy a plane ticket to Europe.
There's a lot encapsulated in those words. How much of your writing comes from your own experience as a woman, Black woman in Virginia?
100%. You know, even when you're writing from imagination, what the material of your imagination is your experience. And, you know, my experience is being myself, being a woman, being a Black woman, being an artist, being very nerdy, being an introvert, being a school teacher, all those intersecting identities and all the experiences that I've had going to Florence and from JMU, you know, you can only draw on what you know, and then you can make it into something different, right? You're not writing exactly what happened to you, but all the little, I think people who make good writers and make art often are people who notice the material of life around them, right? So you're picking up on all these little things. I notice my mom, like if she sees someone limping down the street, she's like, they probably fell down out their bed this morning. Like she has a story that she made up about why they are doing that. And I think that I inherited that. So I'm constantly collecting things. And I think my heartache, the things that worry me, that make me sad, the things that make me happy, the little moments that you notice someone say something are in this story. And especially if someone makes me really mad, I always get my revenge in my fiction.
I'm thinking that fellow who pinched the bottom maybe made somebody a little mad.
No comment.
Okay. Now, you spoke in interviews with Chris and other folks calling your fiction and this collection's dystopian light. And I just want to kind of get a sense, because I'm taking it that that's not the sense of, it doesn't make the reader feel more comfortable. So just kind of give us an idea of what you mean by dystopian light.
So, there's so many different genres of writing, right? Things that people like. And literary fiction is kind of my main genre. And it's just a genre, right? So there's different, when you pick up something that's literary fiction, you're going to have the internal life of characters. You're going to see what's going on inside their head a little bit more. You might have an attention to language and sentence that might be different. And I think dystopian novels have some other conventions, right? And so most of this book relies a lot on literary fiction conventions, but with a novella, I push the story a little bit into the future, and I use some of the conventions of a dystopian story, but I would say it's a dystopia that could be, it's a future that could be today or right. Tomorrow. There's nothing in there that didn't come out of my life experience, out of the street that's adjacent to my street, out of Monticello and the way it looks today, and kind of projecting that slightly into the future, and out of the Unite the Right rally that took place in Charlottesville in August 11th and 12th, 2017, and the buildup of that. All the details of the dystopia, all the details of the unraveling in the story of the environmental apocalypse are really concretely related to what I worry about and what I've seen and noticed in my life and in my neighborhood.
I think that's what does make it really impact, because it's close. It's not something like Ray Bradbury out or Asimov in the future, but it feels very close. You speak of the cell phone that's like a rock in their pockets. It's just the power grid has gone down. You also speak of details in color, and you talk about the literary fiction, but you refer to some, in short spaces, in The King of Xandria, in that short story, he goes into a room of insults. He opens his eyes and sees only white faces, white eyes bulging. And again, the swans are called fat white bodies, so, and the dark, in the Control Negro, naked mahogany skin and dark keen eyes. Use those colors a lot. Are you using it really to bring home the racial piece in this book, or is it your artist perception?
I love that. Literally no one's ever asked me that, and I hadn't thought about it. One thing I learned when I was making this is that your subconscious is better than you are. So people are always like, I know you intended when you did this to do this, this, and this. And you're like, doesn't ring a bell. I didn't mean that at all. But you kind of sometimes did mean it. Or I guess a better way to say it is everything is filtered through you. So your ways of seeing, what you emphasize, what you notice. I'm a visual art teacher, so I'm going to think about how things look. I tend to think about objects. There's a lot of objects that really have personality. When you go to Monticello, I'm going to think about and the emotional weight of objects. There's certain things that I do, and so I think you're probably drawing out some of those things. But I wasn't thinking about that consciously as I was doing it. Yeah.
So that was a reader impression of that. And going to my Monticello, you've got a diverse group of people that are suddenly confronted with storming white supremacists coming and burning down their home. Speak a little bit about, there's a scene in the beginning where they just are flighting, the panic flight, grabbing whatever and getting into the jaunt bus and going. Was it important what they grabbed? I felt a little lifeboat moment, and did that reflect on their character?
Yeah, I love list. There's a whole story in this collection that's a list. But the novella, My Monticello, the longest piece, the last piece I wrote, is the one that's a reaction to August 12th, 11th and 12th in 2017 in Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally. In that story, I had this collective of neighbors, led by a young descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, who end up fleeing their neighborhood and going up and taking refuge in Monticello during this unraveling after white supremacists come to their neighborhood and start to set fire to their homes. And I did, yeah. I love, if any of you, I love the idea of what someone brings has a significance. So there's a scene in the story, I wish I didn't flag it, but where each person's getting out of this jaunt bus and it kind of lists what they're carrying. Like there's the white couple, Ira, across the road, Ira and Carol, who are carrying 2 white hens that they've collected. Like, and you think of that moment, what do you grab in your house when you have to flee, and what does it tell about you? And so each person has an object. There's like a little boy, KJ, who's carrying a pea green suitcase, and there's there's an older woman who's carrying like her Bible. And so each person kind of has this thing, and it's just it's a shorthand way to attend to who is this person and what would be significant about them, and what would you, by that choice that they had to make at that moment. So yes.
Speak a little bit about what happens up there. There's this, group of, and we're not gonna, this is no spoilers here, because the books, the short stories are so full of themes and topics that we could sit here all night, and I think every book club should be having this book to discuss these things that are in here. So there's really not spoilers, but how did this group of thrown together people come together and start making a plan, just sort of getting past, and it wasn't easy, getting past that and figure out how to continue on or even to make a next plan?
Yeah, so I think that this is like a story of apocalypse, right? The world is kind of falling apart. They flee up to Monticello. Monticello is a place out of time. They have the garden. They have like this makings of a moment. And one thing it's kind of a dark story, just to be honest with you. But one thing that's kind of was joyful about it to me, and what was fun about it to me, was that I was able to make a tiny utopia within the apocalypse. And so I was talking to Sadie about this earlier, but they have to choose how to be, and they have to choose whether to come together or not. They could separate, they could leave Monticello, they could each go their own ways, they could fight up on the mountain. But the person, Denasia Love, who's the protagonist of the story, is a student at UVA. She's studying education, a teacher. Again, you rely on what you know. And so what I did was I thought, what does a teacher do to create community on the first day of school? And so I have her at some point they've been fighting, they're trying to figure out what to do, they're under a ton of stress, and she brings this group together, and she basically has them, they call it making a hasty constitution. They end up making this list of the things they want to do for one another. And it's the same thing teachers do for younger kids, do on the very first week of school, where you get everyone to say what they think the role should be, and everyone has buy-in because they have this moment of being able to contribute to it. But in elementary school, you kind of like force them to say what you wanted them to say. I also think, though, the community makes you say what you should say. When you have to look into the face of people who are similar to you and different to you, and you know that your survival is dependent on these other people, you are forced to say something better than if you are separated and you can say, oh, those other people aren't really people and they're bad. So they're forced into this survival situation where they have to look at one another in the eye and decide what they want to do on that mountain. And what they decide is that they're going to create a community. And so within this idea of everything falling apart, within this idea of threat from outside by these people who are coming with fire and saying, this is ours and you don't belong here and this isn't your home, they have to decide they want to make a home at Monticello, and they have to decide that that home is going to center, or they do decide that that home is going to center the voices of people like Denasia, who's a Black young woman. They decide that the women in the space are really, and the feminine energy in the space is really centered in a way that it may not be in our everyday lives all the time. they decide that they're going to allow for diversity in this group, whereas the people they're running from will not. And so they're just making some decisions about what a utopia might look like and how we might think about social justice and about environmental issues, right? They're doing something different.
Do you think their background, where they were coming from, made it easier for them to form?
I don't think it made it easier, but I think, well, two things. One is there's characters, like there's a family, the Yayas, who are immigrants, and they have experiences living in a refugee camp and so forth. So they have a certain voice, a way of being about it. Each person is bringing their own experiences and their own skills to this set. But I will say this, I think that people, I'm a big fan of outsider stories about characters who don't fit neatly within something. That could be because of their identity, it could be because of their life experiences, it could be because they moved from somewhere else, it could be because their brain works differently, they're differently abled, they love differently, all the ways that we're different. We all have this to us, right? But I'm really a fan of that because I think it can be a superpower. And so I think the fact that all of these people have some way in which they don't fit neatly within even their town, right? They live in public housing, and they're just, these ways in which they are set apart also have a superhero quality because they are able to better articulate than someone who feels very comfortable what they want. They're able to articulate the idea of America more clearly than someone who takes for granted that they feel free. The idea of freedom is really important to them. And the way that they articulate that has to do with their responsibility to one another and not just what they want to take from one another. And so I think I like that about that. I think these characters have all the things that make their lives a little bit difficult also give them the superpower to be able to just kind of do the right thing in this circumstance.
That says a lot, from comfortable to uncomfortable, and how we value our freedom and what we can do. So why, writing the Constitution and things like that, so Monticello as the scene for this, why particularly did you choose her going to Monticello?
Yeah, that was like the magic part. Like, I don't remember exactly how I got them to go to Monticello, except for I'll say in the year after August, well, I'll start by saying, after we had the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, it was super troubling to me. I had to go teach students the next, week. It was really hard. And so I didn't know how to respond. I had decided I wasn't going to go downtown on that day, but my partner was down there. We lived really close to there. I was watching and communicating with people who were there. And I didn't know how to respond. And essentially, I responded by writing the novella. I kind of wrote it in my own time. That idea I said earlier of vengeance, it's like, vengeance will be mine when I'm ready. I'm like, I'm going to write what I think, and I'm going to write to figure out what I think, and I'm going to write to figure out a response to something that feels so obscene to me I don't have a good response. So that was kind of a big part of it. Now I've forgotten your question.
Yes, right. Why it landed in Monticello.
Monticello.
Right.
So in that year, one of the things I did is I went to an event where there were all these events about kind of the history of Black communities in Charlottesville, where I learned all kinds of things. I knew a lot of things about Black communities in Charlottesville and the history that we'd shuttered our public schools during massive resistance to integrating schools for 2 years, just shut all the schools. I knew that already. I knew that slaves had built some of Thomas Jefferson's university, UVA. I did not know that people brought their slaves to UVA. Didn't know that. Didn't know that graveyards were segregated. It makes sense, but I hadn't thought about it. So I was learning all these things. At any rate, at one event, someone was introduced as stood up in the audience, a Black woman, and she was introduced as a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I've said this in interviews before, but it's true. I saw her pumping gas the next day, which was really funny because I was just like, now she's everywhere. It was like the woman was everywhere. And it really made me think about how close the history is, and just that people live here that were the families of enslaved people who worked on Monticello. And somehow seeing her connected to me August 12th to Thomas Jefferson's time. It just made this connection in my mind, this imaginative connection, and it made me create that character. And then so that character would go home, right? Her whole thing is her home is being stolen from her. And so it's called My Monticello, right? So she's claiming this ancestral home. The irony being that for me personally, going up to Monticello, when you have family in town, you got to go up there, take someone up there, whatever. I'm always like, this is beautiful. Thomas Jefferson said some cool things. Okay, that's where the little black children made, nails. How horrible. Like, there's this way in which it never felt like a place I was comfortable entirely. And I'm sure you could be of any identity and have that experience. That was my experience. And so I thought, who should Monticello belong to more than a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, and who, designed Monticello, who came up with had this great mind to think of the aesthetics of it. And then Sally Hemings, a family who intimately served the Jefferson family in their home, who built arches, who brought them French food, who took care of their children, and all the other enslaved families who allowed for the wealth of Thomas Jefferson. Who should feel more at home there than a descendant of both those people? And yet, Denasia does not feel at home there by design, because racism, right? And so I thought, for her to be able to claim it and say, my Monticello, right? It's this idea of reckoning with this past, but also this idea, in the end, she says, our Monticello. And there's this idea that this whole community that includes all kinds of people are going to claim this space. And that's kind of the turn in the story. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
The irony being she's chased by white supremacists to go there, right? So we are about that point. If there are questions from the audience, it is a little hard to see with the lights. So I would just ask you to raise your hand pretty high.
But yeah, do you want me to repeat it?
Yeah,
How do I relate to in the dystopian genre, canon, Octavia Butler? How do I see myself in relation to her? Octavia Butler is amazing. I read a bunch of Octavia Butler when I was younger, and then I actually read Parable of the Sower after this, which is, I think it went on the New York Times bestseller list like recently because it's so prophetic to like the moment we're in that people were like, oh my gosh, we need to read this again. Yeah, I definitely feel like there's a relationship between what I'm thinking, especially there's an essay that she wrote called Rules for Predicting the Future. She wrote it for Essence magazine like in the 80s. And basically she was writing Octavia Butler is a black science fiction writer, dystopian writer who centered different characters than you would see in your typical science fiction book. She has women, she has aliens, she has everything. She's got all the things. But she is thinking in one story, she's thinking about race, she's thinking about time. She uses time travel to interrogate slavery, for example. And not in a way like she's trying to, just like, what would this mean? How can I use this tool to think about relationships between men and women or whatever? And so because she does that, people were noticing in some of her work how prophetic she is. She was talking about things years ago that we see now. And so in this essay, she taught Rules for Predicting the Future. She says you can use your fiction to kind of create almost like the idea of a cautionary tale. If you look at what's around you, what would happen if this continues? You're kind of thinking, what would happen if we continue to treat the earth the way we do? What can we see? Well, we know that from science, but what would happen if we continue to treat each other the way we're treating us? What will happen? That's what I was thinking about in this story. If the energy that animated August 12th in Charlottesville continues, what will America look like a little bit down the road? And unfortunately, in the time since the book's been written and published, we've seen, the storming of the Capitol. We've seen people creating horrible violence to hasten a race war in Charleston, for example. We've seen more of that, not less, unfortunately. And so I don't think you have to be really that smart to notice, to think, if people are calling for harm to a group of people, then harm very likely will come. And so what do we want to do about that before that harm comes?
Yeah, and asking those hard questions, which is what your book does put forth.
Is affecting your writing.
How talking about your work is affecting your writing?
It's two different, it's two totally different things. You make something, like I said, your subconscious is smarter than you are. I don't know how to say that in a more eloquent way. And then when you have to talk about it, you have to go back and say, what was I trying to do? For me, the meaning kind of comes last. I didn't think, I'm going to write a story where the central irony is a character that's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson who goes to Monticello. Like, I just was like, I think they're going to Monticello. Like, you're kind of following your subconscious through the story, and you're putting in all these things. And then once you see what you've done, you go back and you hone it and you refine it. And you're constantly in conversation with the thing that you made and kind of figuring out how to make it better, and hopefully you have other readers that can also say, hey, this is the really interesting part too, have you thought about this? And so talking about it actually helps me to understand what I'm doing more. It's only for this project, right? So then how do you use that and kind of take it into the next thing? I do think as I'm writing forward, I'm thinking more about, because I've had to talk to so many groups of people and I've gotten to talk to so many groups of people about the book, I'm thinking about big ideas a little bit earlier, because I know in the end that's what I'm interested in, like what are the essential questions of this? And so I'm kind of going now and going, what are the questions that I want to be talking about, or where do I want to shine attention? Oh, that's so interesting. So I knew when I read that someone was going to be like, which women's college are you talking about? And I honestly, I literally just went to Sweetbriar last week, but I don't think I actually had a real women's college in mind when I wrote that. And I have not gone to a women's college, so I have no direct experience. I think that character in Virginia Is Not Your Home, she's dealing with this idea, I think, it's kind of unclear why she's so uncomfortable. She wants to change her name. She wants to be from somewhere else. She wants to live in France. And it's not totally spelled out why. She's biracial. She's from this rural place. Her intellect is like intimidating to the people around her. And I think that I was thinking about gender, and so my instinct was to push her away from being in this, what you might think of as a supportive all-female space, but her to just kind of, she's constantly rejecting things. And again, spoiler alert, where does she end up? She keeps coming back to Virginia. She keeps getting stuck back home. She keeps getting pushed back to her hometown, of course, because life, that's what happens to us, right? But yeah, I don't have a specific one, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts later.
You escaped that one. Yeah. Yeah. Which cover do you like better?
I love it.
And they're different.
And what I didn't know is the book is in the UK, and there's 2 UK covers, and there's all kinds of covers. I love it. So the first cover, the hardback, I actually did get to weigh in on a bunch, which was really fun because I was an art teacher, and I sent them all the pictures, and we got to go back and forth, and there used to be like black splatter on it, like a zombie apocalypse, but we got rid of that.
They made it more palatable.
I wanted it to be at any rate. Often what I learned is that if your hardback cover is really graphic and kind of, I don't know, it's not really gendered, then often they'll make the other one more personal. In other words, they want like 2 debuts, and they want to highlight 2 things about your story. And so if they had made a really like a woman's face on the first one, the other one would be totally different. In fact, in the UK, it's flipped. The first one is like a photograph of a woman's face. The second one is, more like a picture of Monticello. So that's really common to do. I actually like both of them. I'm really happy with both of them, and I'm super picky, so I'm really happy with both of them. Really quickly, and while you all are thinking, if you have another question, one of the neatest things and the funniest things is when I wrote this book and when I realized it was going to be published, I wrote a little note to Monticello, and I was like, hey, I wrote a book. It's called My Monticello. And they were like, I don't know about this. And like, it was like crickets. I was like, we're going to send it to you. Like, it's getting published by a real publisher. And so I didn't hear anything from them. And then finally, they read the book. They got sent the book. They read the book. Then they did call me. And then they heard it was being made into a movie. And then they really did call me then. And then they actually liked the book. Like, a bunch of people who work there read it because I got to go up there to do a photo shoot and do all these things. And then finally I got to go do a talk at Monticello where they have the book in the bookshop, right? So I was like, if my characters come here and they're stranded, they can read what to do in the book. And they gave me a bowl from a tree that got struck by lightning on the mountain. And I have this really bad dog named Bagels. And I'm like, please don't eat the Thomas Jefferson wooden bowl. It's like really high up on a shelf in our house. Anyway, just thought I'd share that with you.
It might end up in another story, right?
Who knows, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the response from Monticello and from the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. You do talk a little history in the book and talk about Sally Hemings' descendants, which felt like shades of you're not welcome here in Virginia.
Yeah, it was interesting to see what they would say, and they've been really warm now. I actually, they sent me a recording, so the UVA first years read the book, and so they're doing like a story corps thing there where they have people say why they came to Monticello. So they sent me one of a student and her mom saying, we're reading this book and we came up to learn more about the Hemings family, which was fabulous. Yeah, it's really nice. And one more thing is really cool is there's a book club who travels every year to someplace, and they traveled to Monticello, and they went to all the places in the book. They went to the orchard, they went to the chicken store in town, like all the places in the book they went to. It's really neat, and so who knows, maybe there'll be a My Monticello tour at Monticello. We'll see.
Well, there are some folks, when you think urban, you think the sort of an urban feel to it, but you do introduce these orchard people. You mentioned the orchard. Who are these people? They've come out, and you think in a rural community there's going to be a support, and you tear those things apart in both suburbs, urban and rural.
Yeah. So when hopefully those of you who read the novella, there's a. Have any of you been to Carter's Mountain in Charlottesville? Yeah. So it's near Monticello. I have a group of people who have taken residence at Carter's Mountain. They live up in Carter's Mountain, and our motley crew of Denasia and all the things that are going on, they need help, and they end up walking over to the orchard. They end up fleeing over to the orchard to get help, or they get forced there. And the orchard people have the choice of to help them or not, and they're not so helpful. And so part of the reason I chose to do that was thinking about, what do we do for one another? How would the story be different if those people supported this group of brown and black people? And the reason they don't have to, the reason they choose not to, is because it would put them at risk. And they don't feel at risk at that moment from these white supremacists because they're white people, or they look white to these other people. So I thought that was important to show and to think about. I don't know. That was just a part of the book.
There are some hard points, and it is something you keep walking with, and you wake up kind of the next day thinking about and feeling better, actually, by thinking about it. Yeah. Listening to the news, the wildfires, we're doing that in the book. They're listening to the wildfires, but it's happening out west, and then the hurricanes and the terrible storms, and I think there was an interview with somebody in Pakistan who said, if you know this is climate change, then why aren't you doing anything? And I guess my question to you, which is a hard question, but it's a hard question you put forth in the book, is what do you think this book allows us to do in talking about those kinds of things?
Yeah, so there's a huge thread throughout all the stories, not just in the novella, about climate crisis, right? Because again, this is like all my fears that I've now shared with you so that you can worry about them. And it's kind of cathartic because there's something about saying like your worst fears. It's like why we watch horror movies. And then I'm like, now other people can stare at the ceiling and maybe they'll work on it. Maybe they'll want to make a world where these characters are going to be safer than they are at the end of the story. So, but climate is a huge part of that, right? In the first story, Control Negro, there's this line about the waters rising. There's a story called Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse, which is one of my favorites. It's in a list form, and it's, how do you plan for the future when you feel certain the apocalypse is nigh? How do you buy a house, something that's an investment, when you're pretty sure things are falling apart? So So in all of that, yeah, the reason I put those things side by side is because they're my worries, but by writing it, it made me realize that how we do anything is how we do everything. In other words, it is by the same exact mechanism that we can treat brown and black people or whoever we consider other in any circumstance, which could be anybody, really, depending on who you are. How we can treat the other horribly and deny that we're doing that, not believe the other. How we can do that is the exact same mechanism with how we can ruin the planet that we depend on for all life and ignore it and pretend it's not happening, or just not be able to pull it together enough to change it. It's the exact same mechanism. How we treat one another is extremely related to how we treat our planet. And in order for us to fix one, we have to fix both. Because if we can't feel connection with the people who are being flooded in another part of the world and we don't think that their suffering is important, then it doesn't hasten us to act. But we are those people and we will be suffering too, right? And so I don't know, I think they really fit together, and I kind of convinced myself in writing, and I didn't set out going, this is how these are connected. But after I wrote it, I thought, these are really connected, and I see why they're side by side and why they're braided together in this story.
Well, I think it brings forth what we all listen to all the time and allows us to talk about it and read about it in a different way. So I appreciate that. And
also they're both, can I say one more thing? They're both kind of unspeakable things. You know, I had this sweet young woman at Sweetbriar say something to me, and she was talking about whether to say the title to the first story. She was like, I don't think I can say that. I'm not black. She like whispered it, and I was like, how is race so unspeakable that to speak it would be like something that needs to be whispered, like a dirty word under the, it was just the strangest thing, but I understood what she was doing, and I didn't have animosity towards her, but I just thought, it's almost unspeakable to talk about the state of our planet. It's really difficult. Like, that's something I'm thinking about my new project, and it's really hard to breach with people, even just to say, how do you feel about that? It's like almost unspeakable, and that is partly by design, because there are some who profit from that. It's hard to change, first of all, for all of us. There are folks who profit from that who profit from racism, who profit from, I mean, let's be fair, we all do some, right? And so if it's unspeakable, we can't dismantle it, we can't change it, we can't interrogate it in ourselves, we can't work towards it with others if it's unspeakable. So it's just something to work on for me. That's something I've been working on.
Well, I think story sort of crosses all of those topics and allows us to at least open it up, and it doesn't have to be a historic piece or a scientific piece. It's a story. It's about us. It's about the people who are in the room with you. Yeah. Another hard question, or one that you asked through the book, and you asked it a few times is in the novella, is why is it we love what we love? And as a reader, that kept coming back to me to ask that question. So I'm just going to push it back out to you. Is by writing this, did you come to any kind of new insight in that question?
Yeah, in the novella it is this kind of recurring question that Dinesh is asking. She's asking it about her boyfriend, her current boyfriend, who is white. She's like, why do I love this person? She's asking it. And then I think in the story there's kind of this echo reflected back to her is, I don't know, you have to read the novella, but there's a moment, it starts with, I think I said this earlier, it starts with my Monticello, it belongs to, she's claiming it, but then it becomes our Monticello, and this idea of the connections that we have to one another. And I think it really is choice, it's proximity, and it is intention, right? We choose that we are going to care about this thing, and this is the story we're going to tell ourselves about why we care about it. Whether it be the people over there who look different than me, I can make a choice to say that this is that we are connected and that we are, and we are, right? Our fates are connected, but I can make a choice that I'm going to attend to that and care about it as if we're family, right? It's this idea like we're all cousins, right? And so I think that Dinesh kind of comes to that. And I think I don't know, that's the magic of humanness, right? We can, and we do often do that, right? We can do the opposite, but we can also do that. I'm voting for that. I'm an elementary school teacher. I'm like, let's all come together, do the thing.
That could be a song, you think? Her Denisha's grandmother does break out into song at one point.
There's some spirituals in there.
Yeah, and they felt held by it. Yeah. So we didn't talk about the Netflix deal, but that's a pretty big deal. And when is that going to happen? And are you working with the screenwriter for that?
So I have a 16-year-old son, and when I sold the book, I've been working to write forever. Right before this book, my husband was like, I think you should just throw in the towel. Like, you've been working a really long time on writing, I think you'll be happy. And then after I sold the book, he was like, can I make you a sandwich? Like, I want to support your writing career. My 16-year-old was less impressed. He was like, whatever. But then I said, oh, they're making a, we sold the, nowadays when you write a book that seems cinematic, they kind of shop it out and around, and found some people who were interested in it, and they sounded great, and we came up with this deal, and it was a whole thing. And my son was like, the movie really helps build cred. I think the way we think about books are like, yeah, book's pretty good. But when you say, oh, it's gonna be a Netflix movie, they're like, what was the name of that again? So I'm basically just using it as a calling card to be like, read the book, please. At any rate, so that's been really cool. And I'm an executive producer on the movie, which means that I get to have meaningful consult, which so far I have gotten to do. I got to meet the screenwriter before they hired him. I've gotten to read the first draft on the screenplay. And I've just gotten to say what I think about it. And will they do what I think? I don't know yet, but I did tell them.
When are we targeting that?
So a friend was asking me earlier. That I don't know. There are mysteries that I have not unraveled yet, so I can't say yet.
Secrets. Well, what are you working on now? Now that you're getting sandwiches brought to you by your husband.
It didn't last. You'd be surprised how quickly you normalize a thing. I did get a couple good sandwiches. So yeah, I'm writing another book. Right now I'm thinking really about climate, because I just think it's the thing at the forefront of my mind, and I think it should be at the forefront of our actions. And so again, of course, I'm thinking about outsider characters. I'm thinking about also, it's been such a strange time to see how social media, how technology, how kind of QAnon-y stories can motivate people to change in ways that I find disturbing and dangerous. But what if some of those forces could be channeled to make us change, to do what I want us to do? It's kind of my fantasy. I'm like, how can I turn all these things on end and actually radicalize us to do something good, right, for our environment, so that we can live here in relative comfort and peace and so forth. So that's the high-level picture of what I'm thinking about.
Wow. Richard Loaf spoke at Mary Baldwin, and I know he said something about visioning something different. So if you could do that for us, that would be great, and we'll keep working with that too. Any other questions tonight? One back here.
In your Virginia story, your character grows up rural. Is that your experience?
In the Virginia story, did you say the character came up somewhere rural, and is that my story? Yes, not at all. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and it was not rural at all. That was the imagination part, right? So no, but I've known a lot of people who all of a sudden, especially when I was here at JMU, who changed their names. I'm always fascinated by someone who's like, call me Rusty now. And you're like, why? I don't understand. And they're like, that idea, I think, of wanting to change where you're, to change your identity very quickly, to change your external life has resonated with all these young people. Like, a lot of kids have come up and said, that's my favorite story. I really relate to that for all kinds of reasons. And so, yeah, so no, I'm not rural, but I just kind of made that part up.
Well, we are at our time tonight, and is there anything else you want to share with us?
Thank you all so much. It's so nice that so many people came out, and I see smiling faces out there, which I appreciate. And I hope that you all, I hope that you work. I'm just going to be blunt. I hope that you go out and vote and think about other people also when you do that. I really think that's important right where we are right now. Thank you.
All right.